A tablet from the ancient world carried a story capable of unsettling both believers and skeptics. A man receives a warning. A vessel is built. Life survives. Birds search for dry land. A sacrifice follows, but this is not Noah, and this is not Genesis. When the tablet was deciphered in 1872, the disturbing question was not why the story was different, it was why it felt so familiar. Had the Bible borrowed an older flood story? Had different civilizations preserved the memory of the same catastrophe? Or had Genesis taken a story the ancient world already knew and transformed what it meant? The answer is more uncomfortable than a simple yes or no. For many readers, the story of Noah had seemed to stand alone. Then cuneiform literature from Mesopotamia entered the conversation. Suddenly, the flood in Genesis could be placed beside stories that also spoke of warning, destruction, survival, birds, and sacrifice. The similarities were too clear to dismiss, but they were not clear enough to settle the case. That is where the real investigation begins. The tablet that drew attention in 1872 opened a door, but it did not reveal the entire history. Behind it stood several Mesopotamian flood traditions that are often blended together as if they were one account. They are not. One is associated with Ziusudra. The surviving Sumerian text is broken. Large sections are missing. It preserves a flood survivor and a divine warning. But many details have disappeared with the damaged tablet. Those gaps matter. They are not invitations to fill the missing lines with whatever appears in later stories. A broken tablet can prove that a tradition existed. It cannot tell us everything that tradition once contained, and that creates the first mystery. The oldest surviving witness in the comparison may also be the one that speaks least clearly. We know enough to recognize the shape of a flood story, but not enough to reconstruct every step. The silence of the missing lines is part of the evidence. Then comes Atrahasis, a related but different Mesopotamian tradition. Its story begins before the flood in a world of divine conflict. Lesser gods are exhausted by labor. They dig canals and maintain the ordered world until they rebel against the burden. Humanity is created to take over that work. The flood comes later, and its cause is crucial. Human beings have become a problem inside an unstable divine order. Their presence becomes disruptive. The response of the gods grows severe. Yet one divine figure warns Atrahasis and gives him the chance to prepare. There is destruction. There is preservation. There is survival. But the moral world is not the same as Genesis. In Genesis, the earth is not destroyed because humanity has merely become inconvenient. The story describes a world filled with violence and corruption. The problem is not simply that humans are noisy, numerous, or difficult to manage. The problem is what they are doing to one another. That difference changes the emotional center of the flood. But the closest parallels appear in tablet of myth of the Epic of Gilgamesh. There, Gilgamesh hears the story from Utnapishtim, a survivor who escaped a catastrophic flood and received an existence beyond ordinary human mortality. The structure sounds almost impossible to ignore. A survivor is warned before the destruction. A vessel is built, life is brought inside. The waters overwhelm the known world. The vessel reaches a place of rest. Birds are released to discover whether the earth can support life again. After leaving the vessel, the survivor offers a sacrifice. At this point, the accusation of copying feels almost unavoidable. A flood is a broad image. Many cultures could imagine destructive waters. A boat is also understandable. If water is coming, survival requires something that floats. But birds released after the storm? A sacrifice after survival? Those are not merely general images of disaster. They are specific actions placed in a similar sequence. They force the honest reader to admit that these stories belong in the same conversation. Yet, this is precisely where the investigation can go wrong. One side sees the parallels and declares the case closed. Genesis copied an older myth. The other side sees the differences and acts as if no connection could exist at all. Both answers arrive too quickly. Similarity does not automatically prove direct copying. Difference does not erase relationship. Ancient stories did not develop in sealed rooms. Peoples traded, migrated, conquered, remembered, translated, and retold. Images could pass between languages and generations. A flood could survive as memory, symbol, warning, theology, or all of them at once. So, the question is not whether the stories resemble one another. They do. The harder question is what those similarities are doing inside each story. And the most revealing moment comes after the waters fall. In both Gilgamesh and Genesis, the survivor offers a sacrifice. At first, that seems like one more piece of evidence that the stories are nearly the same. Then the paths separate. In the Mesopotamian account, the offering takes place inside a divided divine world. The gods gather around it. The scene reflects need, conflict, regret, and negotiation among divine powers that have not acted with one united purpose. In Genesis, Noah also builds an altar, but the story does not end with hungry gods competing around an offering. It moves toward covenant. God establishes a continuing relationship, not only with Noah, but with his descendants and the living creatures of the earth. The rainbow becomes a sign that the waters will not again destroy all flesh in the same way. The sacrifice is the point of greatest similarity. It is also the point where the meaning changes most sharply. That is the inversion at the center of the story. The detail that appears to prove simple duplication becomes the detail that exposes two different visions of the divine world. One story unfolds among competing gods, whose decisions produce conflict and instability. Like Genesis presents one sovereign God who judges violence, preserves life, and binds the future with a promise. The difference is not decorative theology added after the flood. It shapes the reason for the destruction, the meaning of survival, and the responsibility that follows. In the Mesopotamian traditions, survival may appear as escape, reward, or a solution to a crisis among the gods. Genesis turns survival into accountability. Noah does not leave the ark merely because the danger has passed. He enters a future governed by commands, limits, and covenant. Preserved life now carries responsibility, and that reveals another unsettling problem. If the flood judged a violent world, why does human failure continue afterward? The waters destroy the old world, but they do not remove the human capacity for corruption. The same humanity that entered the ark comes out of it. Survival is not moral perfection. The flood can wash the land. It cannot by itself wash the human heart. That is why covenant matters. It is not a reward for a humanity that has finally become harmless. It is a framework for a humanity that remains dangerous. Judgment is remembered. Life is protected. Limits are established. The future continues under promise, not because human beings have become fully trustworthy, but because they have not. This makes the biblical story more disturbing, not less. The ark is not simply a shelter from water. It is a passage between one ruined world and another world that could still be ruined by human choices. That is a very different ending from a story in which survival merely resolves a divine crisis. So, did Genesis copy Mesopotamia? The evidence does not allow a careless answer. Mesopotamian flood traditions were written down before the final form of Genesis. That fact changed the debate and cannot honestly be ignored. But the date of a surviving text does not prove the date of the event it describes. It does not reveal every stage of oral transmission. It does not prove that one biblical author sat before one tablet and copied it line by line. The texts also do not allow us to prove that every account preserves one identifiable historical catastrophe. Several possibilities remain open. The stories may preserve distant memories of devastating floods. They may reflect a shared tradition that traveled through the ancient Near East. Genesis may have received familiar images and deliberately transformed their meaning. More than one of these possibilities may be true at the same time. The tablets allow us to ask these questions. They do not allow us to pretend that every question has been answered, and perhaps that is why the discovery still matters. And it challenged believers who thought faith required Genesis to exist in cultural isolation. It challenged skeptics who assumed that resemblance was enough to prove plagiarism. It forced both sides to look more carefully. The discovery, therefore, does not reduce the debate to faith against history. It exposes a harder task: reading ancient texts without fear, without exaggerating what the evidence proves, and without confusing a shared narrative pattern with an identical message about God, humanity, or the future. The biblical account does not become distinctive by pretending that no other flood story existed. Its distinctiveness emerges in comparison. The Mesopotamian stories ask what happens when humanity becomes a problem inside a divided divine order. Genesis asks what happens when human violence corrupts the world God made, and whether judgment can be followed by mercy, responsibility, and a future. Those are not small differences. They determine what the flood means. The tablet deciphered in 1872 did not destroy the story of Noah. It destroyed the illusion that Noah could be studied honestly without the rest of the ancient world. And it left behind a final question. What if the most important issue is not who told the flood story first? What if the deeper issue is why Genesis took a story of destruction and survival and turned it into a story about violence, judgment, mercy, covenant, and the frightening truth that the human problem survives, even when the waters disappear? The ancient tablet and the ark do not stand before us as a simple winner and loser. They face one another across the same receding waters, preserving different witnesses to an old human fear that the world can collapse, that survival may come at a terrible cost, and that remaining alive is not the same as becoming worthy of the future. So, which difference matters most to you? The reason for the flood? The character of the divine world? Or the fact that in Genesis, survival becomes responsibility? Share your answer in the comments. And if this investigation gave you a clearer way to read the Bible beside the ancient world, subscribe for the next story in Tablets Before the Bible.